Welcome, Trekkies, to Episode 4 of Best of Trek, Worst of Trek, where we rank every episode of the Star Trek franchise. I'm your host, Dustin Wing. No big surprise that we're starting on today's episode in TNG Season 1 at number 738 with Dogs vs. Reptiles. We're lonely among us. The Enterprise has on board delegations from 2 warring planets and are shuttling them to an unoriginally named mediation planet called Parliament. En route, they pass a mysterious cloud and unknowingly pick up an alien intelligence made of energy. Picard ends up merging with the energy life form and beams himself into the cloud as pure energy. Just when the Enterprise is about to give up looking for him, he re-enters the ship's circuitry and places his energy self into the transporter buffer, so the crew can reconstitute him from his last transporter pattern. The rest of the runtime is filled with a deadly game of cat and mouse on the part of the warring delegates. You're left with the idea that the dog-looking delegates killed one of the reptile-looking delegates and tried to have the ship's galley turn it into soup. As usual, the ending falls absolutely flat. Some noteworthy moments include Crusher playing her R-Zone video game system, Data starts his fascination with Sherlock Holmes, Mark Alamo makes his first appearance in the Trek franchise, and we see possibly the most main cast in Picard's Ready Room all at the same time, which I'd like to give credit to the director of photography on that scene, and this whole episode in general. There's some really smart and interesting camera angle and placement choices for an otherwise laughable episode in the worst of Trek. On to number 737, Conservation of Energy Not Applicable. Or the Mark of Gideon. Kirk beams down to a planet to talk to the leaders, but finds himself in an Enterprise devoid of life, except for one woman that says very little. He stumbles around the empty ship for a while until realizing that they're not in space at all, but in some kind of recreation. Back on the real Enterprise, Spock and crew are railroaded by the rulers of the planet until Spock takes a leap of faith and beams down anyway to find the empty Enterprise set, and eventually Kirk with the rulers, and then they escape. I have the same problem with this episode I have with the short Trek The Trouble with Edward: the laws of conservation of energy. How do you sustain a population of people where there's no habitable square of land to call your own? So many that there's hundreds of them up against a secret scale build of the Enterprise and right outside the office of the rulers of the planet? It's a neat thought experiment about overpopulation, but at least the short Trek I mentioned is funny and genuinely satisfying to watch. Other than a really nice example of 1960s fashion, this one is devoid of any real interest. Breaking the pattern of early TNG episodes, we have number 736, Outlander, Episode 0. Or Sub Rosa. 20 years before Ronald D. Moore would meander through the realm of Scottish fantasy romance stories, TNG decided it had already peaked and its 7th season would start coming down off the pedestal it had been placed on for the last few seasons. Nowhere is that more apparent than the resting place of Marty McFly and Darth Vader. Bev's grandmother dies, and we open this episode at her funeral on a Federation colony of mostly Scottish descent. After reading her grandmother's diary, she discovers Nana was quite a cougar and had a young cub up until her death. After some naughty fantasy time on the Enterprise, she goes to her grandmother's house and discovers her grandmother's young gentleman caller is really a ghost that manifests when a candle that's been in her family for generations is lit. Turns out, not just her grandmother, but centuries of her female ancestors have been taking care of the candle, as its ghost entity took care of them. Beverly resigns her commission to Starfleet to claim her Howard family birthright in her grandmother's house and be with Ronan, the friendly candle ghost. Picard beams down to confront Crusher about the sudden abandonment of her career and meet her new lover. When he asks too many logical questions, Ronan attacks him. Up to this point, it's just a silly 90s cliché romance story and would only be forgettable Trek. But then, Ronan takes over the weather control station to add some cliché lightning and thunder to the scene, where he inhabits the dead body of Crusher's grandmother and attacks LaForge and Data with his force lightning powers. Beverly destroys the candle and ends centuries of her family lineage. There's a disjointed set of cuts where Troy is in Bev's grandmother's house with her, and then she's wandering around the graveyard, and then is back in the house all within seconds. Also, Bev says she doesn't want to be left alone, and the ship's counselor leaves her alone within 5 seconds. Deanna became a worse mental health professional as the series went on, making its series debut on the list at number 735. The Enterprise episode, Pickled Dog Treats. Or A Night in Sickbay. No, I don't care that at the 50th anniversary Trek convention the audience voted the final episode of Enterprise as the worst episode of all time. As we see here, it's not even the worst episode of Enterprise. That honor, I believe, goes to the one that actively detracts from character development and makes little to no sense of any of the plot points that make up the episode. I'd like to thank Alison Pregler for the satirical review on her channel about this episode and convincing me it is well and truly the worst episode of Enterprise. A link to her video is below in the description. Archer, being the most angry captain we've seen played in Trek history, is in this episode Shaxx full-throat screaming at someone while ejecting a warp core, pissed off the entire episode. We open in the decon chamber with some sexy rubbing action that's probably the best thing to watch on screen in the episode before it goes even further downhill from here. The away team is cleared of bioscreening, but Archer took his dog Porthos and he picked up a nasty pathogen on their away mission. To give some backstory, this is the second time in the series Archer is met with this race of easily offended aliens. In an episode that we'll get into in the not-too-distant future on this list, Archer and crew had offended this group of aliens by eating in front of them, which they consider to be on par with performing sex acts in front of them. So Archer thought it would be a good idea to bring his dog along on an apology mission to this planet. Porthos urinated on a tree during the mission that's sacred to these people, and Archer doesn't seem to understand why this might upset a race of aliens he's already incensed by the simple act of eating. He spends the rest of the episode in sickbay attending his pal Porthos, blaming the aliens of this world for Porthos getting infected and getting mad at anyone that points out he's the only person he has to blame for this. And Phlox keeps him alive in a vat of goo and does his medicine magic to make Porthos all better! At the end, Archer must do what a Scott Bakula-played character does best: create a physical scene where he takes his shirt off. In some kind of apology ritual for having a tree urinated on, he has to cut pieces of a tree while reciting words of apology in this culture's native language. In between all the bad A-plot is the most useless B-plot filler in Trek history. Phlox convinces Archer that he's got built-up sexual tension toward T'Pol, and Archer has a titillating dream about that very subject that involves a funeral for his dog interrupted by sexy time with T'Pol. This sexual tension is never brought up again in the run of Enterprise and feels like it actively detracts from the natural flow of character development through the series. Is this inability for male captains to not sexualize their first officers the reason number 1 was removed after the cage?
I got used to having a woman on the bridge.
Is this seriously the same captain that's Earth's best hope of saving them from the Xindi? His priorities are so out of whack, and one can't forget about the minutes of runtime filled with Phlox and Archer chasing a CGI critter around sickbay. There is no redeeming quality to this episode. Here at 734, we have the Lizard Cave, or the Apple. Kirk and a landing party, the size of which you know is not going to be the same number when the episode is over, get trapped on a planet by some kind of sentient machine in the form of a cave that looks like the head of a lizard named Vol that drains the Enterprise power. It turns out there's a race of people too stupid to be alive that have been making sacrificial offerings to it to keep it alive. They don't know anything but how to serve this entity. Kirk ends up figuring out that if it isn't fed, its hold on the Enterprise will be diminished and they can turn the tide and destroy it. There's a whole section of the script about how people don't even know how to procreate, and the landing party dances around the word sex without saying the word sex. I'll never understand how 60s TV could be so sexualized without the ability to say the simple word sex even in the most basic scientific explanations of procreation. The most interesting thing in this one is Chekhov jokingly saying that the Garden of Eden is just outside Moscow. This is more purely skippable Trek. Wrapping up our episodes today, we have number 733, Space Hippies, or The Way to Eden. Enterprise pursues a stolen Federation ship full of hippies that are willing to die when the Enterprise locks a tractor beam and they won't reduce power. Just before they cross the Romulan neutral zone, Scotty beams them out before the ship is destroyed. The group is seeking a planet of perfect peace they call Eden. Their leader is a delusional former doctor named Severin that doesn't believe in medical science or governments or territorial boundaries. We also found out during medical scans of the hippies that Severin is a carrier of a disease that doesn't afflict him, but he could pass on to non-technological worlds that haven't been immunized. He cites his right to privacy and refusal of treatment. Spock believes in the overall ideals of the group, but determines fairly early on that Severin is insane. One of the hippies is an old Russian girlfriend of Chekhov's, and his loose lips cause them to have enough information to take over the ship, which they promptly do and head for their supposed Eden. They get there in a shuttle just ahead of the Enterprise crew. The landing party quickly discovers that though everything they see looks like paradise, it's actually all made of poison acid. They find one of the hippies named Adam dead after eating a fruit from the planet. Spock, of all people, even points out Adam just died in Eden. Then they find the shuttle full of hippies with burned feet from walking on the acid grass. Despite everything, Severin jumps out of the shuttle after seeing what happened to everyone around him and eats a poisoned fruit and immediately dies. This is taken way longer to explain than any other episode of Trek, which is the only reason it's as high on this list as it is. It tries to scratch the surface of a bunch of really deep topics, but does them badly. And we haven't even talked about the absurdity that fills in the rest of the runtime. There's multiple full-length 60s hippie jam songs played throughout, and Spock even gets in on the musical accompaniment to this one. They keep chanting Herbert in unison every time someone tells them something they don't want to hear, and are chock full of groovy 60s catchphrases. Kirk says at the end, "We reach, Mr. Spock," and I didn't get it till I went back through the transcript, and it's just one of the weird catchphrases the hippies say earlier on in the episode. The biggest cautionary tale is that of disbelief of medical science and ignoring the facts that you see around you.
Ah, computer.
That program is available.
Thanks, Majel. Majel, Majel. Thanks, Majel. Majel, Majel. Thanks, Majel.
I thought all the animals were kept in cages.
Majel, Majel.
You're next.
Thanks, Majel. Satire in Trek. Satire in Trek.
Am I crossing you?
You're gonna look pretty funny trying to eat corn on a cob with no teeth.
Professor? I was just thinking.
You might be some kind of Martian.
Vulcan?
Whatever. Bottom line is,
We ain't got no union cards.
in other words,
That's now.
I'm not saying we,
We ain't got no union cards.
but I don't play ball. I have to get clearance.
Let me talk to Bob.
I reached that, brother. I really do.
We are gathered here today to bid the final farewell. We would never hesitate to offer his paw.
Here lies the myth. He never scored.
I mean, if they don't know anything about...
The wild mambo?
What I mean is,
The hunka chunka?
they don't seem to have any natural...
Transference of sexual energies.
How is it done?
That is no longer done.
You're the science officer. Why don't you explain it to the young lady?
Well, it's safe to assume that they would receive the necessary
Boning?
From a machine? That I'd like to see.
What do you say we just do it the old-fashioned way?
He knew exactly how I liked to be touched. The sensations were very real and extremely arousing.
He kind of licked my butt. Just lean into it.
It struck me.
People start pollution. People can stop it.
I hold 6 degrees in interspecies veterinary medicine. I've also earned degrees in dentistry, hematology, botanical pharmacology.
I'm impressed.
You know those 6 doctorates that you hold? Medicine, quantum physics, ancient languages, and not one of them is in psychiatry.
Fragrance with stars.